Your investment theory is brilliant, Mr. Hayes, but it cannot buy my soul.
Tristan stood absolutely paralyzed in the center of the glass-walled boardroom on the 60th floor. His icy green eyes locked on the billion-dollar commercial development proposal that had been violently defaced. Across the meticulously printed executive summary, a thick, bleeding slash of red marker obscured his financial projections, accompanied by a jagged, furious scrawl that read, "Your investment theory is brilliant, but it cannot buy my soul, Mr. Hayes." The sheer audacity of the vandalism radiated a wild, unpredictable energy that felt entirely alien within the sterile, algorithm-driven sanctuary of Hayes Global. His uncle Arthur Hayes, the company's chief operating officer, hovered near the mahogany table with a barely concealed smirk of triumph, murmuring, "It seems your infallible risk assessment models failed to account for a stubborn local artist, Tristan. Perhaps you aren't as capable of handling this acquisition as the board believed." Tristan slowly unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, his jaw tightening into a rigid line as he absorbed the calculated insult from both the anonymous woman and his treacherous uncle. "This isn't an algorithm failure, Arthur. It is simply a minor bug in the system," Tristan replied, his voice a low, lethal whisper that instantly dropped the temperature in the room. "And I am going to personally step down into the dirt to exterminate it before the market opens on Monday." The descent from the penthouse suites of Manhattan to the crumbling, graffiti-stained streets of the lower industrial district felt like crossing the border into a chaotic foreign country. Tristan sat in the back of his sleek midnight black Bentley, staring out the tinted windows as the meticulously paved avenues gave way to cracked asphalt rusting fire escapes and the raw, unpolished grit of a neighborhood fighting against the inevitable tide of gentrification. He operated his entire existence on cold, hard data, viewing human emotion as an unnecessary liability that corrupted efficient decision-making. Yet this singular woman, Lily Brooks, had managed to completely stall his flagship mega-project by simply refusing to vacate her worthless property. He tapped his long, calloused fingers against the leather armrest, mentally calculating the exact psychological pressure points he would need to press to force her immediate surrender. She was the sole remaining holdout in a 12-block radius, a chaotic variable disrupting a perfect mathematical equation, and Tristan possessed absolutely no patience for variables. As the car rolled to a silent halt in front of a dilapidated, ivy-choked warehouse that looked ready to collapse under its own weight, he adjusted his cuffs and stepped out into the biting winter air. He was a man accustomed to buying governments and silencing corporations, and he fully intended to break this rebellious designer's spirit within 5 minutes of crossing her threshold. The interior of the warehouse was a sensory assault of flying sparks, the sharp tang of hot metal, and the vibrant, overwhelming explosion of half-finished artistic chaos. Tristan stepped over a tangle of heavy-duty power cords, his expensive leather shoes crunching against a floor dusted with wood shavings and dried clay, his analytical eyes immediately scanning the vast space for the source of the disruption. He found her, standing atop a battered aluminum ladder, her wild cascade of dark hair tied back with a stained rag, wielding a welding torch with the fierce, focused intensity of a warrior holding a sword. "Miss Brooks, I presume you are the one responsible for returning my legal documents in such an unreadable, juvenile condition." Tristan projected his voice over the hiss of the torch, his tone dripping with an icy, aristocratic condescension. Lily killed the flame and pushed her heavy protective goggles up to her forehead, wiping a smudge of grease from her cheek as she looked down at the billionaire intruder with a mixture of pity and sheer defiance. "I merely corrected the errors in your paperwork, Mr. Hayes, because clearly your team of expensive lawyers forgot to calculate the absolute value of human dignity," she shot back, her voice ringing clear and steady through the drafty studio. She descended the ladder with an effortless, predatory grace, closing the distance between them until he could see the fiery, uncompromising gold flecks in her hazel eyes. "You are trespassing in a place where your money has no jurisdiction, so state your business quickly before I ask you to leave." Tristan observed the erratic, paint-splattered woman standing before him, refusing to let her raw, magnetic energy disrupt the cold, calculating rhythm of his thoughts. He reached slowly into the interior pocket of his charcoal blazer, his movements deliberate and heavily practiced, withdrawing a sleek leather checkbook and a silver fountain pen that cost more than her entire annual income. "Let us abandon the theatrical poetry and speak the only language that actually matters in this city, Miss Brooks," he murmured, his gaze sweeping dismissively over her stained overalls and the crumbling, water-damaged ceiling above them. "Everyone in this world has a precise mathematical number, a threshold where their so-called morals surrender to practical survival. So I am going to ask you to write yours down right now." He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the blank check with a sharp, aggressive flourish and extended the crisp piece of paper toward her, watching her face closely for the inevitable flash of greed. "You can buy a studio in Paris, a villa in Tuscany, or a lifetime of uninterrupted artistic freedom. All you have to do is take this paper and allow my bulldozers to level this public hazard by Monday morning." Lily stared at the blank check hovering between them, her chest rising and falling in a steady, angry rhythm as the sheer arrogance of his proposition settled heavily into the space. "You operate under the pathetic delusion that every breathing soul is just a line item on your corporate spreadsheet, Mr. Hayes," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. Without a single moment of hesitation, Lily snatched the blank check from his perfectly manicured fingers, her eyes locking onto his with an unblinking, feral intensity that made his breath catch unexpectedly in his throat. In one swift, fluid motion, she tore the heavy, watermarked paper straight down the middle, the sharp, ripping sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent, cavernous studio, before letting the useless halves flutter gently down to the sawdust-covered floor. Tristan stared at the shredded paper at his feet, his mind experiencing a profound, unprecedented short circuit as the flawlessly calibrated algorithm of his reality was brutally disrupted by her completely illogical defiance. He had offered her absolute financial salvation, an escape from the crushing poverty that clearly surrounded her. Yet she had looked at a blank check from a billionaire and chosen to destroy it out of pure, stubborn pride. The sheer proximity between them suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with a dangerous, intoxicating friction as he stepped closer, towering over her in a desperate attempt to physically intimidate the woman his money could not break. "Do you have any comprehension of the catastrophic mistake you have just made? Or are you truly arrogant enough to believe that a few rusty metal sculptures can stop a billion-dollar commercial conglomerate?" Tristan growled, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged frequency. "I am not trying to stop your conglomerate. I am trying to preserve the only piece of genuine history left in this hollow, artificial city, and you cannot buy what is already priceless." Lily fired back, tilting her chin up to meet his dark, furious glare without an ounce of fear. As Tristan shifted his weight, intending to deliver a final, crushing verbal ultimatum, his peripheral vision caught sight of a bizarre architectural anomaly at the far end of the sprawling studio. Integrated directly into a sleek, modern glass installation was a massive, crumbling section of an old brick wall, its surface deeply scarred, blackened, and permanently warped by the intense, devouring heat of a massive historical fire. The moment his eyes registered the charred, soot-stained bricks, a sudden, violent, physiological reaction hijacked his body. His chest constricted painfully, his pulse skyrocketed, and the cold, unyielding mask of the CEO shattered to reveal a glimpse of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled back half a step, his breath hitching in a harsh, ragged gasp, as the phantom smell of suffocating smoke and the agonizing, buried memories of the night his entire family was reduced to ash threatened to drown him. Lily instantly noticed the catastrophic shift in his demeanor, her angry expression softening into a sharp, analytical curiosity as she watched the powerful, untouchable billionaire suddenly look like a man staring directly at a ghost. Does the history of this place make you uncomfortable, Mr. Hayes? Or is it just the terrifying realization that there are some scars your money can never erase? She asked softly, her voice losing its combative edge as she closely studied his pale, stricken face. Tristan forcibly dragged his eyes away from the burnt bricks, digging his fingernails into his palms until they ached in a desperate, frantic bid to regain his emotional absolute zero, rebuilding his shattered psychological fortress with terrifying speed. Tristan pulled the cold, indifferent armor of the corporate titan back over his vulnerable, bleeding soul, suppressing the ghosts of his past with ruthless efficiency. He could not afford to let this unpredictable, observant woman realize she had accidentally stumbled upon the one catastrophic weakness that drove his desperate, obsessive need to pave over this specific plot of land. I do not need your permission, your signature, or your misguided artistic approval to ruin your life and take what belongs to my company, Tristan stated, his voice now entirely devoid of inflection, a dead, chilling monotone that promised absolute destruction. By tomorrow evening, every major supplier in this state will blacklist you. The city inspectors will condemn this structurally compromised warehouse, and you will be drowning in a tidal wave of litigation that will bleed you dry for the next decade. He stepped back, re-establishing the physical and emotional boundary between them, projecting the aura of a man who held the power of life and death over her entire neighborhood. Lily crossed her arms tightly over her chest, refusing to let him see the genuine spark of fear his threats had ignited within her, standing tall amidst the chaotic beauty of her creations. You can starve me out, you can bury me in lawsuits, and you can tear down my walls, but I will proudly stand in the rubble of this building before I ever surrender to a hollow, calculating machine. She declared her fierce, unwavering spirit, shining like a beacon in the dim light. Tristan turned on his heel without another word, the heavy fabric of his coat swishing sharply as he marched toward the exit, desperately needing to escape the suffocating, dangerous gravity of her presence. The encounter had been a catastrophic failure. Instead of neutralizing a minor obstacle, he had inadvertently ignited a brutal, unpredictable war against an adversary who fought with a reckless, terrifying passion he simply could not compute. As he stepped back out into the freezing, biting wind and slid into the silent, secure sanctuary of his waiting car, he could still feel the phantom heat of her defiance burning against his skin. The charred brick wall haunted his vision, a brutal reminder of the secret, guilt-ridden agenda he was hiding from his treacherous uncle, his board of directors, and the entire financial world. He stared out the tinted window at the crumbling warehouse, realizing with a cold, sinking dread that Lily Brooks was no longer just a business problem to be solved with a fountain pen. She was a living, breathing, emotional variable that possessed the terrifying power to dismantle his perfectly ordered universe. And for the first time in his meticulously calculated life, Tristan Hayes had absolutely no idea how to code a defense against her. The war between a mind strictly governed by algorithms and a heart violently forged in the fires of wild, untamed art had officially begun. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in calculated cruelty, orchestrated with the precision of a man who viewed human suffering as mere collateral damage in a corporate takeover. Tristan didn't return to the warehouse in person. Instead, he unleashed a barrage of institutional violence designed to suffocate Lily Brooks until she gasped for mercy. It began with the sudden cancellation of her raw material contracts, then escalated into a series of relentless, aggressive zoning inspections that brought city officials swarming the warehouse like locusts. Lily, however, met every legal and logistical blow with a defiant, creative intensity that Tristan found infuriatingly impossible to predict. She didn't panic. She didn't call for help. She simply transformed the condemnation notice plastered on her front door into a provocative piece of street art, a massive, weeping mural that depicted a cold, faceless king crushing a rose under his heel. By the third morning, the mural was trending across social media, turning her local struggle into a viral crusade that threatened to transform Tristan's flagship project from a symbol of progress into a PR disaster. He sat in his office, his eyes burning from hours of reviewing legal briefs, when his assistant knocked timidly to inform him that his Uncle Arthur was waiting outside, flanked by 2 members of the board of directors. Tristan felt a vein throb in his temple as he realized that Lily's artistic resistance had provided the exact ammunition his uncle needed to begin questioning his competency. Arthur Hayes entered the office with the practiced, predatory grace of a man who had spent 3 decades waiting for Tristan to stumble his face, a mask of faux concern that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Tristan, the board is deeply troubled by the optics of this petty squabble in the lower district, Arthur said, his voice smooth and syrupy as he gestured for the board members to take seats. The press is portraying us as Goliath, bullying a local artist, and the delays are costing us millions in projected revenue. Each day the ground remains unbroken. He leaned over the desk, dropping the mask to reveal a thin, triumphant sneer. If you cannot resolve this bug in the system by tomorrow evening, I am afraid the board will have no choice but to initiate an emergency review of your management of this acquisition. Tristan felt the familiar, suffocating grip of panic tighten in his chest, a sensation he had fought his entire adult life to suppress through rigorous, absolute control. He didn't blink, didn't let a single flicker of his internal turbulence reach his face, knowing that any display of weakness would be interpreted as a fatal vulnerability. This project is on schedule. Arthur and the artist will be evicted before the weekend, Tristan replied, his tone as hard and unyielding as polished granite. He walked them to the door, his movements rigid, his mind racing through 100 different contingency plans to eliminate Lily Brooks from the equation once and for all. The following afternoon, Tristan arrived at the warehouse unannounced, his patients having long ago been incinerated by the relentless pressure from his family and the board. The air inside was strangely quiet, the sharp hiss of welding torches replaced by a haunting, melodic sound of a cello playing in the far corner of the massive, dust-mote-filled space. Lily was sitting on a wooden stool, her eyes closed in concentration, drawing rapid, frantic charcoal strokes across the paper, with a feverish intensity that made her appear almost possessed. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge the heavy, dangerous aura of the billionaire looming in her workspace. She just continued to draw, as if her life depended on it. Tristan stalked toward her, the sound of his footsteps like heavy hammer blows against the silence, until he stood close enough to smell the charcoal dust and the faint, sweet scent of tea that clung to her. The inspectors are returning with an eviction warrant in exactly 3 hours, and this time there will be no artistic protest to save you, he stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble that barely disturbed the cello's melancholic melody. Lily finally stopped the charcoal snapping in her hand as she lifted her head, her gaze meeting his with an unwavering, exhausted defiance that suddenly felt entirely different from their previous encounters. You are running from something so fast, Tristan, that you're willing to destroy everything in your path just to keep from looking at what's chasing you, she whispered, her voice surprisingly soft, lacking the sharp, combative edge he had grown to expect. Tristan froze, the prepared, vitriolic retort dying in his throat as the raw, piercing truth of her observation hit him with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. She wasn't fighting his money anymore. She was fighting his soul, and for the first time in his life, he was utterly defenseless against such a profound, intimate intrusion. He looked down at the paper in her lap and saw that she hadn't been drawing sculptures or abstract shapes, but a detailed, hauntingly accurate portrait of himself. Not the billionaire CEO, but the terrified, broken boy he had spent 20 years burying. He reached out to grab the paper, his hand trembling with a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, but stopped inches away, his composure finally beginning to fray around the edges. I am not here to be analyzed by a failed artist who thinks the world is a gallery, he growled, though his voice lacked its usual cutting authority. Lily stood up, stepping directly into his space, her presence a burning heat that threatened to melt the last of his cold, calculated resolve. You're not here for the warehouse at all, are you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of recognition. You're here because you're terrified that if you tear this place down, you'll have nothing left to prove who you used to be before you became a machine. The silence that followed was absolute, a terrifying vacuum in which the entire carefully constructed algorithm of his life seemed to lose its meaning. He turned away from her, his chest heaving with a desperate, frantic need for air, and paced toward the massive, soot-stained brick wall that had been the catalyst of his nightmares. He placed a hand against the rough, freezing bricks, the sensation grounding him in the painful, undeniable reality of his existence. If you reveal what you suspect to anyone, my uncle, the board, or the press, I will destroy you with a level of ruthlessness that you cannot even begin to comprehend. He whispered, his back toward her, his voice a strained, agonized rasp. Lily walked up behind him, stopping just far enough away that she wasn't touching him, but close enough that he could feel the radiating warmth of her empathy. "I'm not your enemy, Tristan, and I don't give a damn about your corporate power games or your uncle's pathetic schemes," she said, her voice filled with a surprising, gentle strength. "But I won't let you murder the only part of yourself that's still human, just to satisfy your obsession with control." Tristan closed his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped a protruding brick, the dam of his emotional suppression finally irrevocably beginning to crack. He was a man who had conquered the markets, silenced rivals, and built a legacy. Yet he was being dismantled by a woman with nothing but charcoal defiance and a stubborn, inconvenient heart. He stood there in the shadows, trapped between the cold, logical world that demanded his absolute perfection and the wild, messy reality that this woman was forcing him to face. Suddenly, a loud, jarring ring of his phone shattered the heavy electric silence, bringing the crushing reality of his professional obligations crashing back into the room like a cold tidal wave. He pulled the phone from his pocket, his face hardening as he read the name, Arthur Hayes, flashing on the screen. A reminder of the wolves waiting in the boardroom to tear him apart. He answered the call, his voice instantly snapping back into the cold, detached monotone of the machine, leaving Lily standing in the dim light of the warehouse as he paced away. "I am busy, Arthur. I will handle the matter before the deadline," he barked, his eyes never leaving the soot-stained wall, his entire posture re-stiffening into that of an unstoppable, emotionless force. He hung up the phone and looked back at Lily, his expression a carefully curated blank slate that signaled the return of the cold, calculating billionaire. "I will grant you 48 hours to clear this building, and I suggest you use them to find a new life, because my charity toward your defiance has officially expired," he stated, his voice a sharp, clinical command. He walked past her toward the exit without another glance, his movements robotic, his focus entirely on the cold, brutal logic of the eviction. Lily watched him go, a profound, aching sadness blossoming in her chest, as she realized that even with the walls between them beginning to crumble, his fear was still far stronger than his heart. The nor'easter hit Manhattan with brutal ferocity, burying the glittering skyline under a suffocating blanket of ice. Inside his climate-controlled penthouse, Tristan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the storm batter the city, while his mind ran a cold risk assessment algorithm. Local news reported severe flooding in the industrial district, exactly where Lily's dilapidated warehouse stood vulnerable. Mathematically, the storm was a perfectly timed miracle, an act of God that would destroy the compromised building and efficiently solve his eviction problem without legal repercussion. He poured a glass of scotch, trying to embrace the flawless logic of letting nature eliminate the frustrating variable that had disrupted his life. Yet the amber liquid tasted like ash. Every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was Lily standing fiercely atop her ladder, her hazel eyes blazing with an indomitable spirit the freezing rain was currently trying to drown. The pristine silence of his penthouse felt like a tomb, amplifying the erratic, illogical pounding of a heart he had spent decades trying to silence. He stared at his reflection, realizing with a sickening jolt of clarity that if she died in that ruin tonight, the empire he built to feel safe would mean nothing. The moment rational justification crumbled, Tristan moved with a frantic, explosive energy that entirely defied his meticulously crafted persona as the ice-cold CEO of Hayes Global. He abandoned the expensive scotch, snatched his heavy wool overcoat, and sprinted toward the private elevator, completely ignoring the frantic buzzing of his phone as his Uncle Arthur undoubtedly called to gloat about the weather. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his armored SUV, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as he navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked streets. The driving conditions were catastrophic, visibility reduced to mere feet, but a singular primal panic drove him deeper into the heart of the storm. He was breaking every rule of risk mitigation he had ever authored, risking a fatal accident for a woman who despised everything he represented. Yet turning back was a physical impossibility. The streetlights flickered and died as he crossed into the lower district, plunging the crumbling neighborhood into absolute darkness. As he pulled onto the flooded curb outside her warehouse, a massive crack of thunder shook the ground, and he saw the western roof buckling under the weight of the accumulating ice. Tristan kicked the heavy metal door open with a brutal surge of adrenaline, his heart hammering as he stepped into the freezing, waterlogged cavern of the design studio. The interior was a nightmare of groaning support beams, shattered glass, and icy rain pouring relentlessly through the failing ceiling, ruining the vibrant artwork Lily had fought so fiercely to protect. "Lily," he roared over the deafening howl of the wind, his frantic gaze sweeping the dangerous, debris-filled darkness, until he spotted a small, stubborn figure near the back. She was desperately struggling to haul a heavy tarp over a massive pile of charcoal sketches, her clothes soaked through and her body violently shivering from the plummeting temperature. Tristan sprinted across the flooded floor, dodging a falling light fixture, and grabbed her upper arms, spinning her around with a force born of pure terror for her safety. "Leave this worthless garbage and get out of here immediately. The roof is literally coming down on our heads," he commanded, his voice a harsh bark that echoed in the chaotic space. Lily wrenched her arms out of his grip, glaring up at him with magnificent defiance. "These are my life's work, Tristan. I am not leaving them just because you think everything can be replaced with a checkbook," she screamed back over the storm. The sheer magnificent stupidity of her stubbornness completely broke the last remaining constraints of Tristan's famous self-control, pushing him into a state of pure protective instinct. Before Lily could reach for another soaked canvas, an ominous, sickening groan echoed from the rafters directly above them, signaling the catastrophic failure of a primary wooden support beam. Tristan didn't waste a single millisecond arguing. He lunged forward, wrapping his powerful arms securely around her waist, and physically tackled her backward, just as the massive, splintered timber crashed violently onto the exact spot where she had been standing. The impact sent a shockwave of dust and freezing water over them, plunging the warehouse into absolute, suffocating darkness as the main power grid finally succumbed to the storm. They rolled across the damp concrete floor, Tristan using his own body to shield her from the flying debris until they slammed hard against the reinforced steel door of a small interior utility office. He kicked the door open, dragged her inside, and slammed it shut, sealing them in a claustrophobic, pitch-black sanctuary as destruction raged outside. They collapsed onto the floor, gasping frantically for air in the heavy silence of the tiny room. The terrifying realization that he had nearly watched her die shattered his invincible armor, leaving him stripped bare and utterly consumed by an emotion he could no longer calculate. The utility room was freezing, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and the terrifying echo of the studio tearing the studio apart just inches beyond the steel door. Tristan immediately stripped off his heavy cashmere coat and wrapped it securely around Lily's violently shivering shoulders, his hands lingering as he felt the fragile, freezing tremble of her frame. "Why did you come here, Tristan?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice stripped of all its usual fiery combativeness, leaving only a raw, trembling vulnerability that cut him straight to the bone. He sat beside her on the cold floor, pulling his knees to his chest, desperately trying to construct a logical, business-oriented lie to explain why the CEO of Hayes Global had risked his life in a blizzard. The liability of a civilian dying on a property tied to a pending acquisition would be catastrophic for our quarterly projections, he replied, but his voice cracked, the words sounding pathetically hollow, even to his own ears. Lily let out a soft, sad sigh, pulling his coat tighter around herself, inhaling the deep, woodsy scent of his cologne. "You are a terrible liar for someone who makes a living manipulating the truth," she murmured, turning her head slightly so he could feel her breath against his frozen cheek. "Tell me the actual reason, Tristan, because algorithms don't drive into hurricanes to save stubborn artists." The walls of Tristan's psychological fortress finally collapsed under the gentle, demanding pressure of her honesty, leaving him drowning in the terrifying, chaotic waters of his own suppressed trauma. "That charred brick wall in your studio, the one you preserved as a piece of artistic history, was part of a tenement building that burned down 25 years ago," he confessed, his voice a low, agonizing rasp that pierced the darkness. "My parents were trapped on the top floor because the landlord had illegally padlocked the fire escapes to save money on security renovations, and they burned alive while I watched from the street below." He felt Lily stiffen beside him in horror, but he couldn't stop the flood of painful, poisonous truth pouring from his lips after decades of absolute silence. "My Uncle Arthur subsequently acquired the blackened land through a shell company, burying the tragedy under layers of corporate bureaucracy, and I have spent my entire life planning to pave over this specific dirt with concrete and steel." He turned to her, his jade eyes somehow finding hers in the pitch black, his soul completely bare and bleeding. "I wanted to erase the memory of my utter helplessness, but when I saw you standing in the rubble today, fighting so fiercely to protect what I hated, I realized I was just burying my own ghosts." Lily felt a profound, overwhelming ache in her chest as the full, devastating weight of Tristan's confession settled over her, completely rewriting everything she thought she knew about the arrogant billionaire. She reached out in the darkness, her small, cold hands finding his face, her thumbs gently tracing the rigid, tense lines of his jaw as she offered him the one thing his money could never buy. "You cannot erase pain by pouring concrete over it, Tristan. You only build a heavier tomb for yourself," she whispered fiercely, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "I kept that wall because I wanted to show the city that even from the most catastrophic destruction, beauty and resilience can survive, and that is exactly what you did." Her words acted like a soothing balm on a lifelong festering wound, dismantling the final barriers of his self-imposed isolation and flooding his system with a terrifying, electrifying warmth. He leaned heavily into her touch, his hands instinctively coming up to grip her waist, pulling her closer until the space between them vanished entirely in the freezing, cramped office. The intense, combative energy that had defined their relationship since the moment they met suddenly transmuted into a powerful, undeniable magnetic pull, drawing their shattered pieces together in the dark. He was no longer the ruthless corporate titan, and she was no longer the defiant enemy. Driven by the intoxicating surge of adrenaline, the freezing cold, and the overwhelming emotional release of his confession, Tristan abandoned every single mathematical calculation that governed his existence. He leaned forward, his hands sliding desperately from her waist up to tangle deeply into her damp, messy hair, and captured her lips in a kiss that absolutely obliterated his sanity. It was not a calculated seduction or a polite exploration. It was a hungry, ravenous claiming, a desperate plea for salvation from a man who had been suffocating in his own algorithms for 20 years. Lily gasped against his mouth, her initial shock instantly melting into a fierce, matching heat as she wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, pulling him down with a demanding, intoxicating force. She tasted like rain fear and an addictive, wild sweetness that short-circuited his brain, overriding his logic and replacing it with a burning, singular desire to possess her completely. He pressed her back against the cold steel door, his body a heavy protective shield against the freezing air, pouring all of his suppressed grief, rage, and sudden, terrifying adoration into the desperate kiss. The storm howling outside the warehouse became a distant, meaningless whisper compared to the deafening roar of his own heart finally breaking free from its cage. In that cramped, dark room, Tristan surrendered unconditionally to the unpredictable chaos of human emotion. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air in the freezing darkness, the world had fundamentally and irreversibly changed for the calculating CEO of Hayes Global. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he listened to the frantic, matching rhythm of their heartbeats, feeling a sense of absolute clarity he had never experienced in a boardroom. I am not going to let my uncle pave over this warehouse, Lily, and I am certainly not going to let him use you as a pawn to strip me of my company, he murmured, his voice vibrating with a new, lethal determination. The realization of Arthur's true, insidious agenda hit him with crystalline precision. His uncle had purposefully stalled the eviction, manipulating the neighborhood, and using Lily's defiance to manufacture the exact crisis needed to stage a corporate coup. Tristan slowly opened his eyes, the jade depths now burning with a terrifying fire that promised absolute devastation to anyone who dared to threaten the woman in his arms. The algorithms are dead, and tomorrow morning I am going to officially declare war on my own empire, he promised, pressing a lingering kiss to her temple as the storm outside began to ease. Lily looked up at the man who had just sacrificed his perfectly ordered universe to save her, knowing with terrifying certainty that they were about to walk into a battle far more dangerous than the hurricane. The logic was broken, but their calculated surrender had just begun. The morning sun filtered through the dust-streaked windows of the warehouse, illuminating the wreckage of a life's work. But for the first time in years, the chaos felt like a canvas of infinite potential rather than a disaster. Tristan stood amidst the debris, his charcoal suit ruined by mud and plaster, his phone buzzing incessantly with frantic notifications from the board of directors, demanding his presence at an emergency meeting. He ignored them all, his entire focus trained on Lily, who was meticulously salvaging the most vital of her charcoal sketches from the floor. The previous night's storm had not only destroyed the warehouse roof, but had effectively forced the hand of the board. Arthur had already scheduled an emergency vote to strip Tristan of his CEO title based on the uncontrollable instability of the commercial project. Tristan picked up a fallen photograph from the floor, a picture of Lily with her grandmother at a local cultural fair, and felt a chilling clarity wash over him. Arthur thinks he has orchestrated my downfall by using you as the final, unmovable variable, Tristan said, his voice cold and calculated. He believes this warehouse is the weakness that will break me, but he is fundamentally miscalculating the new architecture of this deal. He pulled out his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen, as he began to reverse engineer his own corporate strategy, systematically dismantling the very foundation of the acquisition he had spent months perfecting. Instead of clearing the site, Tristan began drafting an emergency counterproposal to the board, one that completely abandoned the commercial luxury high-rise in favor of a hybrid living legacy development. We are going to retain the warehouse structure, retrofit it as a public arts incubator, and integrate it into the commercial complex, he explained, his eyes burning with the thrill of a predator who had just changed the rules of the hunt. Lily paused, her charcoal-stained hands stilling as she looked at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. You are going to fight your own board, lose millions in projected margins, and completely alter your master plan just to save this building? She asked. Tristan walked over to her, his movements stripped of all corporate stiffness, his gaze heavy with a newfound, terrifying sincerity. I am going to win, and in doing so, I am going to make it impossible for Arthur to survive his own greed, he vowed. He tapped the screen, finalizing the upload of the document to the board's private server, effectively forcing their hand before they could even open the session. The boardroom at Hayes Global was a battlefield of polished mahogany and shifting allegiances when Tristan strode through the heavy oak doors, followed by a surprisingly calm and composed Lily Brooks. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of smug anticipation, ready to deliver the final strike. But he faltered the moment he saw Tristan's unshakable, predatory confidence. Tristan didn't wait for the usual pleasantries. He stood at the foot of the table, placing the newly rendered, breathtaking architectural blueprints onto the velvet surface, directly under Arthur's nose. Before you vote to remove me for my inability to manage this neighborhood artist, take a look at the revised profit model, Tristan commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that silenced the room. He pointed to the digital overlay showing the warehouse seamlessly integrated into the high-rise, a design that would qualify for massive federal historic preservation tax credits and elevate the entire property's value by an additional 30%. This isn't a retreat, it's the most lucrative deal this firm has ever seen, Tristan stated, watching Arthur's face drain of color as the board members began to murmur in stunned, hungry approval. He had outmaneuvered his uncle, transforming the catalyst of his own destruction into the engine of his absolute dominance. Arthur scrambled to recover his hands shaking as he reached for the blueprints, desperate to find a flaw in the logic. But the sheer financial genius of Tristan's pivot left him utterly exposed. This is preposterous. You're giving away premium real estate to a sentimental project, Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that revealed his true, pathetic desperation. Tristan leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that was caught by the room's high-fidelity microphones. What you call sentimental, I call a strategic masterstroke, Arthur. And while you were focused on ruining my reputation, you completely missed the fact that I've been tracking your secret offshore accounts for months. He tapped a button on his tablet, and the wall-mounted screen behind them immediately projected a cascade of incriminating financial logs detailing Arthur's illicit payments to the saboteurs of the processing plant and his hidden attempts to undermine the board's trust. The room erupted in a chaotic, deafening roar of betrayal and shock. As the board members turned on Arthur, their predatory gazes shifting from the CEO to the traitorous COO, Tristan looked at the chaos with the detached indifference of a god. His hand finding Lily's, his fingers interlacing with hers in a firm, possessive grip that signaled his victory. He had fought the fire, he had survived the storm, and he had finally absolutely conquered the ghosts of his own past. The brutal, swift extraction of Arthur Hayes from the corporate premises marked the definitive end of an era, his furious threats echoing hollowly down the marble corridors as security escorted him out. Tristan stood at the head of the boardroom table, his posture relaxed but radiating absolute authority, watching the man who had orchestrated his parents' demise finally face his ruin. The board of directors, terrified by the sheer volume of evidence and eager to distance themselves from the disgraced executive, had unanimously approved the hybrid development plan within minutes. Lily remained quietly by Tristan's side, her fingers still intertwined with his, providing a steady, grounding warmth that kept the adrenaline and the ghosts of the past from overwhelming his senses. You played the game perfectly, Tristan, but I think it is time we leave this sterile room and breathe some real air, she whispered, her thumb gently stroking the back of his hand. He looked down at her, the icy, algorithmic CEO, melting away to reveal a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried for 2 decades. I am entirely finished with games, Lily, he replied, a profound, weary peace settling over his features. The glass prison of his corporate empire had been irrevocably shattered, and as they walked out together, he felt the first genuine ray of sunlight warm his soul. 6 months later, the relentless, biting winter had surrendered to a vibrant, blooming spring, and the lower industrial district thrummed with a new, harmonious rhythm. The construction site was a magnificent symphony of architectural integration, where sleek, soaring columns of modern steel and glass gracefully embraced the preserved, reinforced brickwork of the historical warehouse. Tristan navigated the bustling site, wearing a simple, open-collared linen shirt and dark jeans. The rigid, suffocating armor of his tailored suits permanently retired to the back of his closet. He no longer viewed the workers as mere variables in a profit margin equation, but as the essential craftsmen bringing their shared, wildly ambitious vision to life. He paused near the central courtyard, watching the sunlight filter through the newly installed atrium roof, marveling at how a project born of cold calculation had transformed into a living, breathing testament to resilience. The media had dubbed the new development a masterstroke of urban planning, praising Hayes Global for its innovative approach. But Tristan knew the true genius belonged entirely to the woman working inside. He checked his watch, a rare, genuine smile lifting the corners of his mouth as he turned his steps toward the artist's sanctuary. The interior of Lily's newly renovated studio was a breathtaking juxtaposition of raw history and luminous modern design, bathed in golden afternoon light that danced across her half-finished sculptures. The infamous charred brick wall stood proudly at the epicenter of the room, meticulously stabilized and framed by clear, protective glass, no longer a monument to tragedy, but a powerful altar of survival. Tristan slipped silently through the heavy wooden doors, leaning against the doorframe as he watched Lily fiercely molding a massive block of wet clay. Her dark hair pinned up haphazardly, her face smudged with earth. The combative, desperate energy that had defined their first encounter in this very room was completely gone, replaced by a deep, resonant intimacy that hummed comfortably in the quiet air. "You are staring at me with that highly analytical look again, Mr. Hayes. Are you trying to calculate the exact structural integrity of my latest piece?" she teased, without turning around, her intuition sensing his presence immediately. "I am merely admiring the only variable in the universe that I have absolutely no desire to control," he murmured, walking slowly across the polished concrete floor to stand directly behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the intoxicating, familiar scent of clay lavender and the wild, untamed essence that was purely hers. "I spent my entire life running from the fire, building firewalls of money and logic to ensure I could never be burned again. But I was just suffocating in the dark," he confessed, his voice a low, vibrating rumble against her skin. He turned her gently in his arms, ignoring the wet clay she accidentally smeared across his pristine shirt, his jade eyes searching her hazel ones with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. "You forced me to look at the ashes, Lily, and you showed me that it is possible to build something magnificent directly on top of the ruins." She reached up, her messy hands cupping his face, her touch infinitely tender as she wiped away the invisible scars that had haunted him for 20 years. "We both used our worlds as shields, Tristan. You hid behind your algorithms, and I hid behind my stubborn pride, pretending I didn't need anyone to survive," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a soft, devastatingly sweet kiss that held none of the frantic desperation of the storm, only the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had finally found his home. "I have something I need to show you. A final piece of administrative business that requires your immediate attention," Tristan said, pulling back slightly, his eyes sparkling with a rare, mischievous glint. He took her hand, lacing his clean fingers through her clay-stained ones, and led her out of the studio, guiding her toward the private secured elevator that connected the arts incubator to the new executive suites. The ride to the top floor was silent, but the air in the small cabin crackled with a nervous electric anticipation that made Lily's heart hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The doors slid open to reveal a stunning, sun-drenched office that looked out over the entire city. But it wasn't the panoramic view or the luxurious furnishings that made her gasp in shock. Mounted perfectly in the center of the main wall, enclosed in museum-quality UV-protected glass, was the original crumpled commercial proposal she had violently defaced 6 months ago. The thick, bleeding slash of red marker and her furious, jagged handwriting, stating that his investment theory could not buy her soul, were displayed like a priceless historical artifact. "You framed my insult?" she asked, a burst of incredulous laughter escaping her lips as she walked closer to examine the spectacular display of her own rebellion. Tristan stepped up behind her, his reflection mingling with hers in the protective glass. The juxtaposition of their past hostility and their present unity beautifully captured in the pain. "I framed the exact moment my heart started beating again, the precise second a terrifying, magnificent woman took a red pen to my perfectly ordered life and destroyed my illusions of control," he answered, his voice dropping to a reverent, husky whisper. He turned her around to face him, the playful amusement fading from his eyes, replaced by a profound, overwhelming adoration that stripped him bare of any remaining corporate defenses. "I offered you a blank check that day, believing that everyone had a price. But you taught me that the only things worth having in this world are the things that money cannot possibly buy." Slowly, deliberately, the billionaire CEO, who had once viewed human connection as a catastrophic liability, dropped to one knee on the plush carpet, entirely surrendering his pride and his algorithms. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, midnight blue velvet box, popping it open to reveal a stunning, vintage-cut diamond ring that caught the afternoon sunlight and splintered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Lily Brooks, you are the glitch in my system, the chaos in my code, and the absolute love of my life, he declared, his voice breaking under the weight of his truth. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy spilled over Lily's eyelashes, tracking down her clay-smudged cheeks as she looked down at the powerful, brilliant man who had willingly dismantled his entire empire just to build a world where she could thrive. Are you absolutely certain about this, Tristan? Because I am highly unpredictable, incredibly stubborn, and I will definitely ruin all of your expensive shirts with my art supplies. She managed to choke out through a watery, radiant smile. I am banking on it, darling. I have officially retired from risk management, and I am fully prepared to embrace a lifetime of beautiful, unpredictable chaos by your side, he promised, his green eyes shining with unshed tears. Yes, she breathed the single word, a triumphant, joyful surrender to the love she had once fought so fiercely to deny. Yes, Tristan, 1,000 times yes. He slid the perfect, glittering ring onto her finger, standing up to pull her into a fierce, all-encompassing embrace, burying his face in her neck as he spun her around the sunlit office. The heavy, oppressive silence of his past was entirely eradicated, replaced by the vibrant, messy, and infinitely beautiful symphony of their shared laughter, echoing through the glass walls of their new sanctuary. They stood wrapped in each other's arms by the massive window, looking down at the thriving, preserved neighborhood below, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow over the seamless integration of historic brick and modern architecture. The battle was over. The ruthless puppet master had been overthrown. The ghosts of the fire had been laid to rest, and the mechanical heart of Hayes Global had been replaced by something fiercely alive. Tristan rested his chin on the top of her head, feeling the steady, reassuring rise and fall of her chest, knowing that the greatest victory of his life was not a corporate acquisition, but the surrender of his own walls. Lily leaned back against him, her fingers tracing the cold metal of his watch, completely at peace with the man who had once been her greatest adversary. The world outside would continue to demand logic, numbers, and cold calculation. But inside this room, and within the foundation of the life they had forged together, love was the only algorithm that mattered. Their calculated surrender was complete, not as a defeat, but as the ultimate glorious victory of two souls who had finally found the courage to simply be human.